am super excited about today's program. And I want to start by thanking Dennis Lockhart for running to the roar with me. Our Rotary four-way test starts with, is it the truth? And it ends off with, is it beneficial to all? We all seek to live that motto and credo every day as Rotarians. So who else other than Dennis Lockhart to lead us in a conversation with Judge Ludig? Dennis really needs no introduction. As a reminder for newer members of the club, he was the 14th President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and has been one of our consistently most engaged club members over the years. Thank you for leading by example. Everyone respects Dennis's opinion, not just on monetary policy, but on public policy in general. So we cannot think of anybody better than for you to take the stage and introduce the judge and lead us in this really important discussion. Thank you, Dennis.
Well, thank you very much, President Adrian. It's an absolute privilege to do this today with Judge Michael Ludig. I'm going to start with an introduction just so the audience gets a feel for the background that has led to such strong opinions on major issues of the times. Judge Ludig, and let me follow my notes here because I always get things out of order and garble introductions. So he's a graduate of Washington and Lee University and Virginia Law School. He clerked for Justice Anthony Scalia at the D.C. Court of Appeals, clerked for Chief Justice Warren Burger from 1983 to 1984, served in the Reagan White House as Associate White House Counsel, served in the Department of Justice in 1989 in the George H.W. Bush administration, assisted Justices Souter and Thomas in their nominations and their preparation for confirmations. From 1991 to 2006, he was a federal circuit court judge in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, where he established himself as a conservative jurist. He was mentioned frequently by George W. Bush as a nominee, a potential nominee for the Supreme Court of the United States. And after this distinguished judicial career, he was general counsel for Boeing and currently serves for the Coca-Cola Corporation as counselor and senior advisor. So that's quite a resume, I proposed, Judge Ludig, that we make the organizing question, the central question for today's conversation, what's at stake on November 5th? But before we get to that, I'll raise that as the final question. I'd like to go back and hear some of the developments and events and your personal experience in them that led to some of your very strong views. So take us back, if you would, to January 5th, 2021, and describe your experience.
Well, thank you, Dennis. I'll get to those questions after I tell the audience that I'm really here to hear Dennis Lockhart and his. In my 4 years of travel to this point, I've never had the honor of taking the stage with a former Federal Reserve Board president. Neither have I ever had the honor or pleasure of taking the stage with a former United States Court of Appeals judge. Those are the only two people that I would ever want to appear together with on a stage, because those two classes of people are above and beyond all politics. And that's what I've tried to do over the past 4 years. But thank you to the Atlanta Rotary Club. It is a distinct honor for me to be here today. I came to a meeting in February of this year, and I left saying to my wife that it was the most fun I'd ever had in my life. It was the warmest reception from the nicest people that I've ever met in my life. So thank you for having me back today. What's at stake, and then I'll backtrack to answer your question as to January 6th. What's at stake on November 5th is nothing less than America's democracy and rule of law, for reasons that we all know. Where did this journey to this point start? It started on January 6, 2021, as we all know. On that fateful day, the former President of the United States, who is today the Republican Party's nominee for the presidency again, attempted to overturn the 2020 presidential election that he had lost fair and square to our current president, Joe Biden. He obstructed the joint session of Congress in its counting of the Electoral College votes for the presidency, which votes had already been cast in favor of then candidate Joe Biden. And for the first time in American history, almost 250 years, there was not a peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next in America. The peaceful transfer of power is perhaps the most fundamental tenet of American democracy. Without the peaceful transfer of power, America has no democracy. It's really that simple. We'll develop this further, but let me go back. I was happily retired on January 4th, 2021, when in the evening I got a call from a good friend of mine, Richard Cullen, who was then the outside counsel to then Vice President Mike Pence. And he said, Judge, he calls me Judge, I'll answer to anything. But he said, Judge, do you know John Eastman? I said, yeah, I know John. He's a former clerk of mine, maybe 20, 25 years ago. Why do you ask? And he said, you don't know, do you? And I said, no, I don't know anything, Richard. He said, well, this afternoon, John was in the Oval Office with the president and vice president, telling both of them that the vice president could essentially overturn the election 2 days thence. And I said, well, you can tell the vice president that I said he has no such authority under the Constitution or laws of the United States. And Richard said, he knows that. I told him that that was your view. And I said, well, then there's nothing else I can do, Richard. And we hung up. And as we hung up, my wife, who of 40 years, who had been overhearing half of that conversation, just looked at me and said, my God, what is that? And I said, well, I guess Donald Trump is going to try to overturn the election. And my wife, with tears in her eyes, she said, do you know what that would mean for America? And I said, yes, I do. And she said, you have to stop this. And she said, you can stop it. You can stop it. And I said, no, I can't stop this. And so we went to bed that night with her pleading with me to do something, and my pleading with her in return that there was just nothing that I could possibly do. So I get up early in the mornings around 4:30. I have to be ready for a call from John Murphy of the Coca-Cola Company, who gets up early similarly. And Richard Cullen called me back and he said, we have to do something immediately. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I don't know what we have to do, but you have to get your voice out across the country immediately, because the president and the vice president are meeting in the Oval Office today for lunch. And without going through all of my faux pas with my ultimate vehicle, Twitter, I ended up tweeting that the Vice President of the United States has no authority under the constitutional laws of the United States other than to count the Electoral College votes as they had been cast. He has no authority whatsoever to refuse to count those votes, discount them, or in any otherwise not count the votes as they had been cast. And I went on to say, because I was speaking to the two of them in particular, this is not a question of loyalty of one man to another. Neither of the president nor the vice president has any higher loyalty than to the Constitution of the United States. And so the next thing that happened to me was I went over to have lunch with my wife on January 6th around noon, and she was crying. And I said, well, what's wrong? And she said, are you not watching? I said, no, I'm not watching. What's going on? She says, I don't know, but the United States Capitol's under attack. And they, whoever is doing this has erected gallows on the lawn of the Capitol, and they're chanting, hang Mike Pence. And under the banner on the television was reading that the vice president relied upon my advice to him in refusing to overturn the election. And my wife was just in tears and scared out of her mind. That's where it started. So for the past 3.5 years, the former president, in his utter obsession to convince the American people that he actually won the 2020 presidential election and that it was stolen from him by who, we don't know, and to avoid accountability for his grave offenses against the Constitution on January 6th, he, together now with his Republican Party, have corrupted American democracy and the rule of law. And of course, today he's again the nominee, and he's essentially running on a platform that it was right to do what he did on January 6, 2021, and that the American people should have another opportunity to elect him to the highest office in the land. So to link it up, as we lawyers say, that takes us to what I said were the stakes on November 5th. On November 5th is a test of Americans' commitment to America's democracy and the rule of law, Dennis.
And You, along with Lawrence Tribe, have written a seminal article on the 14th Amendment and particularly Article 3, essentially taking the position, as you've just said, that President Trump, former President Trump, is ineligible. And you make a distinction between an insurrection or a rebellion against the United States of America as opposed to a rebellion against the Constitution. Can you explain that?
Yes, I'd be glad to. As Dennis said, there's no question in my mind, and the Supreme Court did not say to the contrary, by the way, that Donald Trump was disqualified from the presidency on January 6, 2021, because on that day he engaged in an insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution of the United States. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment had never been interpreted before. It was ratified in 1868 together with the addition of the 14th Amendment, of course. And its very purpose was to prevent the return to high office of Confederates who themselves had previously taken an oath to support the Constitution of the United States and thereafter engaged in an insurrection or rebellion against not the United States, but against the Constitution of the United States. It's the Constitution of the United States that is specifically and expressly referenced in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. The importance of the distinction is this, and we won't dwell on it today, but we all have in our minds what it means to engage in an armed insurrection against the United States of America. That's an act of treason. But of course, on January 6th, the argument would be persuasive, I think, that the former president didn't engage in an armed insurrection against the United States. By the same token, there's no question whatsoever that he did engage in an insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution of the United States. And that insurrection against the Constitution was in his effort to remain in power, notwithstanding the vote and the will of the American people in favor of his successor, Joe Biden. In other words, in constitutional language, what the former president did was violate the sacred executive vesting clause of the Constitution, which simply says, as we all know, that the president shall remain in office for 4 years unless he's elected again to the office of the presidency by the American people. So at the same time that he broke that cardinal principle, if you think about it, at the same time he also attempted to deny Joe Biden the powers, the office and the powers of the presidency, to which he had become entitled by his election by the American people.
So the oath is central to this. And although it's not about your experience, the story of Mike Pence making his decision and being influenced by his son is an interesting story. Can you quickly relate that story?
Yes, I'll try to be neutral. From the January 6th, actually to the present day, the country has wondered about the specifics of the vice president's decision not to yield to the former president's demands on January 6th. But until 2 years ago now, when I think it was Woodward and Costa's book Peril came out, no one had known this. In that book, the authors published the handwritten notes of the vice president back at the time, in which he said to his diary, in effect, "I have decided not to preside over the joint session of Congress on January 6th. So as soon as I read that, I was downstairs at our house in Chicago. I walked that up to my wife, and she was getting ready, and I said, "Stop everything. I want to read you something." And I read that out loud to her. And then I said, "Do you realize now that we came within a whisker of a civil war in this country? The only constitutional responsibility for a vice president in the Constitution is to preside over the joint session of Congress when it counts the electoral votes for the presidency." And Mike Pence had decided, I think a week before January 6th, maybe 10 days before, that he would not preside. For another discussion, we can talk about what on earth would have happened had he not shown up on January 6th. But to Dennis's question, once that diary entry became public, the vice president went public. And he said, of course, I had made that decision. But that weekend, my son came to visit, and his son's in the military.
A Marine.
And his son said, "Dad, I take the same oath to support the Constitution of the United States that you do. How can you square this and your decision not to preside over the joint session with your oath?" And the vice president said publicly that was the moment in which he decided that he would preside over the joint session on January 6th, and he would count the votes as they had been cast by the respective states. And that was the vice president's moment. And of course, for that moment and in that moment, he was an American hero.
In June of 2022, you were invited to testify in Congress in front of the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack. You've called it a great honor. Tell us what you said.
Well, we don't have that much time. So I want to first focus on that introduction to the question, Dennis, if I may. Recall that at that point, everyone from the prior administration who had been asked to appear before the January 6th committee of the House refused and defied subpoenas. So I think it was someone from ABC News called me before and said, Judge, have you been asked to testify? And I said, no, I've not yet, but I would be honored. I would be honored to testify for the Congress of the United States of America. And the times being what they are, no one even thinks like that anymore. They're seemingly more concerned with dishonor than honor, with few exceptions, like the Honorable Jeff Duncan, who's with us today. Jeff Duncan's an American hero because he was honored to speak the truth to the American people. So even judges get to have a little bit of fun. So I'm going to say, in answering that question first, I said, so, to my knowledge, no one in America had ever seen, much less heard, a federal judge before, right? And we do things differently than everyone else, with the possible exception of the Federal Reserve Board. And so I was nervous as a cat. So I went in there and, I did the only thing I could do, which is speak like a judge. Well, as it turned out, America was more than receptive to that. But the point of that story is that from the moment I opened my mouth, some person on Twitter tweeted, oh my God, can you believe Judge Ludig is doing this? He had a devastating stroke only 5 days ago, and he is still standing before the nation and testifying to the Congress. Well, so I let this go on, and the whole world was concerned and, or tried to appear to be concerned. But my actual friends were calling my wife going, oh my God, what happened to Mike? He had a stroke? And my wife said, I don't even know what you're talking about, right? So I let this go on for 2 or 3 days until finally I wrote certainly the best tweet that I've ever written in my life, and maybe the best words I've ever written in my life, explaining that no, I had not had a stroke, that knock on wood, I was as healthy as I had ever been. But I was very serious that day, and I was careful to utter every word as precisely as I could. But what I said, I said, Donald Trump and his allies and supporters are a clear and present danger to American democracy. For what he and they had done on January 6, 2021, and incidentally, what they promised even then, 2.5 years ago, to do this January 6, 2025. And I went on to explain that this way. I said to the Congress that the former president and his allies are preparing in open view of the American people to overturn the 2024 presidential election in the same way that they attempted in 2020, but to succeed in 2024 where they failed in 2020. Now those words, someone up on Capitol Hill recently called prescient.
Let's talk about some of the decisions of the Supreme Court of the United States. You've been highly critical. But 2 cases in particular, Trump v. Anderson, which is the Supreme Court's Colorado decision on the applicability of Article 14, Section 3, as well as the presidential immunity decision. And to borrow a quote, you've said, the Supreme Court has betrayed the Constitution and America. Can you comment?
Yes, I'd be glad to. We have a Supreme Court of the United States in order that that court will decide the most important, the most pressing issues of our times. The disqualification of the former president from the White House again was perhaps the single most important issue that the Supreme Court could ever decide, and it was pressing. From the moment that the argument in the case began, and for the 3 hours that followed, the Supreme Court barely asked a single question about the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and the former president's disqualification under that section. It was crystal clear from the moment the Supreme Court arrived at the bench that it was never going to decide that question. And of course it didn't. I was going to say worse, it punted, but that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is the Supreme Court had an affirmative obligation under the Constitution of the United States to decide the case. It doesn't matter how hard it was. And they just said, no. We're not going to decide it. You know what we're going to do? We're going to kick it back to Congress, where we know, I imagine them thinking, Congress will never act. And of course, Congress couldn't possibly decide that question. So that was a betrayal of the Constitution and a betrayal of America in America's moment of need.
Liz Cheney has taken a courageous position, and I've heard you say that too many politicians put party over country. Do you think that is the case today, that elected politicians are putting party over country?
We can judicially stipulate to that, or I guess take judicial notice of that in my case. But no, what I said to Congress 2.5 years ago, which is indisputably the truth about politicians writ large, but more importantly about today's politicians, they never believe that they have to choose between their country and their party, or even their personal political ambitions, and the United States of America, when every single day that they are in office representing we the people, they are required to choose between our country and their political party and personal political interests. I mean, just look what's happened on the Republican side of that equation for the past almost 4 years. Well, first off, there are precious few Republican officials who have even dared speak up against anything that the former president has done, including January 6th. And in my view, those same people, 99.9% of the Republican Party, don't have the moral or political courage simply to tell the truth to the American people. I mean, never before in American history, again, almost 250 years since the founding, has there been such a premium on truth. And of course, all of you business people understand premium, right? Why is there a premium on anything? Because there's not enough of it, if there's any of it. And that's where we are with our political class today, as we come into the final weeks of the campaign season.
Let's talk a little bit about the consequences of these developments since January 6th of 2021. It's been reported based on polling that many Americans, and I would say especially young people, have lost faith in the Constitution and in the institutions of our democracy. Many are referring to the Constitution, the rule of law, elections, electoral college system, and there is, how should I put it, just a loss of faith. Comment, please.
Yes, a loss of faith and confidence in Americans' elections, in our Constitution, and in our rule of law. That is the definition of the corruption of American democracy and the rule of law, Dennis. And there's only one person and now one party complicit in that corruption of democracy and the rule of law. I'm working on a piece for somebody on the way up today, and it occurred to me to say, and don't hold it against me if you don't see it in its final version. This gets a little too cerebral even for me. But I said, Donald Trump and the Republican Party have presented the choice as between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump as a Hobson's choice for America and Americans. But in Donald Trump, the Republican Party has found the one man singularly unfit to be the protector and defender of America's democracy and the rule of law. So I was sketching out, this is not a Hobson's choice at all, right? I digress in that way, Dennis, just to make the point that there's no one that can dispute that whatever has happened in terms of the faith and confidence of Americans in their elections, the Constitution, the rule of law, is attributable to the former president and the Republican Party.
A recent New York Times article that cited a number of serious scholars, particularly Erwin Chereminsky, said that the Constitution is the problem, the cause of our dysfunctional politics. And these scholars go on to argue that the past election outcomes have been contrary to the popular vote, as well as decisions of the Supreme Court by judges who are confirmed by senators representing a minority of our citizens. So is our Constitution still up to the task?
Dean Chemerinsky is, I consider, a friend. He actually asked me to write a blurb for that book. But no, the Constitution is not responsible for the precarious place that we find ourselves in today, period. The Constitution has prevailed over these past 4 years. What's failed are the elected officials and other officials who have failed in their responsibility and duty to enforce the Constitution of the United States. Now, what Dean Chemerinsky is talking about, though, and he is correct about this point, the framers of our Constitution made it very exceedingly difficult to amend the Constitution, and that was back at a time of an agrarian economy with, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people versus today's United States of America, 350 million people. So the Constitution ought to be easier to be changed or amended than it is. And what the Dean is talking about are some of the existing provisions of the Constitution that probably should be considered further in the years ahead, most notably, I gather from your quote there, the Electoral College. For short, for our purposes today, it's the Electoral College that allows for the election of a president who does not receive the majority of the popular vote cast for the presidency. Very complicated process by which the states cast their respective electoral votes for the presidency, but that's the so-called Electoral College. And my reaction to that is, certainly during my lifetime, that presidents have succeeded to office without the popular vote of the American people. But as with all things, I find, at least in my life, political, at any given moment, it depends on whose ox is being gored, right? Which is to say, with respect to the Electoral College, that, 10, 15, 20 years from now, the popular vote might be more disposed toward the election of a Republican president than a Democratic president. And if we change the Constitution, all that's going to change is that a different ox is going to be gored.
Dennis, as you perhaps ask one final question, I want to open it up to the audience. Members, if you'd like to ask a question, there's a microphone right there next to Jamie. Please go ahead. One final question.
Okay. With Jay Johnson, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, under the auspices of the American Bar Association, you formed the Task Force for American Democracy. Tell us what that task force is going to do. I think it says something that you even have to form such a task force, but what are the activities of that task force?
Well, the time has come for all Americans to stand and affirm their belief and commitment to America's democracy and the rule of law. By the way, never before in our lives, nor in the lives of any other Americans in the past 250 years, has anyone ever thought for one moment that they would be called upon to support and defend democracy itself and the rule of law. America's democracy and the rule of law are the fundamental tenets of our constitutional republic. They are what has made America the beacon of freedom and the envy of the world for almost 250 years. And yet today, both American democracy and the rule of law are under vicious assault. Now, lawyers in particular are uniquely qualified and uniquely obligated to support and defend democracy and the Constitution right now. They take an oath to do so. And every day their work is in support of the Constitution of the United States. So we agreed to co-chair this Task Force for American Democracy at the ABA. The task force itself comprises perhaps 25 of the most notable, the most well-known, respected, and recognized and articulate advocates and proponents of American democracy and the rule of law in all of America. And so we are about, first, this election that's coming up in 2 weeks. We want to ensure that, again, this election is the fairest and the most secure election in all of American history.
Go ahead, Dennis. David, go ahead.
David, go ahead.
I am curious what personal blowback you have faced for taking the principled stands that you have taken and what that's been like for you and your family.
Well, thank you for the question. I get it every day. Look, in 4 years, I've not seen a single person challenge me in public, either, orally or in writing, for anything that I've said. That's been a blessing, a surprising blessing. Look, I think that, I think it's largely because I want to believe that 95% of the Republicans, and I'd like to think 100% of the conservatives, believe everything that I've said and are cheering me on. They just, they're just too cowardly to speak themselves out of, as I said, either moral or political cowardice. But that's just the way it's been. And for the first year and a half, I waited for anyone to come out and just to say that I was an okay guy, But of course, no one ever did that. And to this day, like we said, there's only a handful of Republicans, like Jeff Duncan, like Adam Kinzinger, like Liz Cheney, that have yet to come out and say one single thing of consequence against the former president and their Republican Party. That's a tragedy. We can't have, we have to have two healthy, robust political parties in America if the democracy is to function. Today we only have one, and it remains to be seen when the other will return to a healthy status as one of the two political guardians of American democracy.
We have time for one final question.
Yeah, Robert Franklin, former president, Morehouse College. 300 years before Jesus of Nazareth appeared, Aristotle wrote 2 small books on ethics. He said, in order to sustain a democracy, we need certain virtues among its public leaders: moderation, wisdom, integrity, courage. And it's interesting, a couple of thousand years later, John F. Kennedy co-published a book, Profiles in Courage, highlights 8 U.S. senators who placed country above party. I think that you and Jeff Duncan and others in this room stand in that tradition. I just want to commend the importance of public virtue. But then Aristotle gave a lot of attention in his book on ethics, and this is fascinating and a little unusual, to the importance of friendship. He said, good friends help us to recalibrate our inner moral compass. Good friends hold us accountable, inspire us to be our best. I couldn't help but think, as you talked about your wife and those conversations, that you have that kind of presence and support and conscience. Could you say more about the importance of a good spouse, a good partner, and as friend?
Yes, and thank you, sir, for everything that you just said. I've spent much of the past 2 years in particular reading the Founding Fathers, Aristotle, and many of the other great philosophers of the ages on ethics. And also on leadership. And I couldn't state it any more eloquently than you did. And what I tried to say that before the Congress of the United States, particularly on the question of friendship. I said 2.5 years ago that I posed the rhetorical question, so where do we start to heal this nation? And I said we start where we all human beings have always started to heal severed relationships by talking to each other as friends and as Americans, fellow Americans who share the same hopes and dreams for America. But again, 2.5 years ago, not one of those political people that I had appealed to has given one thought to what I said, and they're obviously not going to before the November 5th election.
Maybe it starts at Rotary clubs all over the country, right?
Amen. And I forgot to say this because I was so giddy about appearing with the Federal Reserve Board president. But what I had intended to say, and take me at my word, was that I was honored to be here today, but I was humbled beyond words by our opening prayer, by the Pledge of Allegiance, and then by that magnificent national anthem. If those things can't humble America, then America cannot be humbled.
Well said. Dennis, I'm going to give you the last word in a minute. But before we do that, we're going into overtime successfully like our beloved Falcons. Joel, if you'll move the slide forward. I want to remind everybody there is no meeting next week, as we'll be observing Indigenous Peoples Day. Following on from that, we have a program with Muhammad Massaquoi. If you have any doubt about how strong he is, look at Glenn Jackson nodding his head, so ask him about that. And please, reinforcing the theme of today's discussion, please send in to Gina and me what you and your businesses are doing in the season of service to make the elections in Georgia a model of integrity and bipartisan participation. Secretary Raffensperger challenged us to do that. I hope you all looked at the email where we are trying to lead by example in our company. So please step up and reinforce today's message. So with that, Dennis, thank you for leading us in this heavy but riveting conversation from a constitutional expert. You have the final word before we adjourn.
I just want to say, it's Judge Ludig, it's been a privilege to do this, to be part of the conversation. You're an okay guy, for sure. And I'm sure, regardless of political persuasions, everyone in our audience here thanks you for your patriotism and your voice and raising some of the most serious issues of our republic. Thank you for the stances you've taken.
We appreciate that. Hear, hear.